All right, welcome back everybody for video lecture number 3. We are discussing anatomy and physiology. Glad to have everybody here. Hope you are getting something out of the first 2 videos. So let's just dive in here and get started, picking up where we left off. Assessing the status of the circulatory system. We assess how well the circulatory system is performing by checking the pulse and the blood pressure. So let's look again at perfusion. So when we talk about perfusion, we can define that as the delivery of oxygen and nutrients to the cellular level. And don't forget about the removal of the waste product, CO2. We can define hypoperfusion as an insufficient supply of oxygen and nutrients. And it so happens that we can look at shock as a profound depression of that as well. So hypoperfusion meets that same definition as shock. And so what we have is an increase in CO2. We have an increase in the amount of acid being produced, and we have loss of heat. And we'll talk a little more about this, how this slide kind of fits in to what we're talking about. But you can see here that oxygenated blood coming out of that, from that left ventricle out the aorta, comes down, transport of O2 and CO2 by the blood. We're going to come down here, and what's going to happen is at the cellular level, and we call this cellular respiration, where we're going to pick up the carbon dioxide and deliver the oxygen, right, through diffusion, the same thing that happens at the alveoli. Once the CO2 is picked up, it's going to be brought back up here to the right atrium. It's going to go through that process of the right side of the heart, where it goes, deoxygenated blood comes over here. We have an exchange of CO2. The CO2 is breathed out during exhalation, and a fresh supply of O2 is standing by here at the alveoli to be put back in and go back to the left side of the heart. So over half of your blood volume is plasma, which is mostly water. We know that oxygen does not dissolve easily into water, right? So plasma is responsible for only 1% of the oxygen transported to the cell. All right. 45% of blood volume is cellular, which includes red blood cells. So what that means is if we don't have red blood cells to transport oxygen to the cell, then you're in a bad place, right? Because we can have all the plasma that we want, but without red blood cells, we're not going to have oxygen exchange. Hemoglobin is found inside of that red blood cell. It's a primary carrier of oxygen. So you need a red blood cell, and you need hemoglobin inside that red blood cell in order to transport oxygen to the cell. That's basically what we're saying there. We need to be thinking of carbon dioxide as a waste product, and it must be removed. If we do not remove this, carbon dioxide is going to convert to hydrogen, and we're going to have acid. Carbon dioxide moves from the cellular level back to the lungs, primarily in the form of HCO3, which is your first introduction to this, which is called bicarb. Okay, so some CO2 is removed by plasma and hemoglobin. And I'm going to walk you through that when we get there, okay? But that's the first time, that we talked about what HCO3 is. Don't worry about it. I'm going to make it pretty simple for you. Let's talk about blood pressure, and let's talk about systolic. So we can look at the definition of that, right? As the force on the walls of the arteries is known as blood pressure. And the systolic blood pressure measures the effectiveness of the pump function of the left ventricle. I'd rather you remember that than anything. I want you to understand that systolic blood pressure, what it tells us is the health of the left ventricle. Systolic blood pressure is when that left ventricle contracts. And that's what it's telling us. It's telling us the overall health of that left ventricle. Blood pressure, pressure exerted against the walls of the arteries when the left ventricle is at rest. The resistance measured is related to vessel diameter. This is what we're talking about, diastolic blood pressure, guys. Okay, so when we talk about diastolic blood pressure, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is vessel size. We're talking about the diameter of the blood vessel. If the larger the blood vessel is, meaning dilated, the lower your diastolic blood pressure is going to be. The more constricted the vessel is going to be the higher your diastolic blood pressure is going to be. Okay, so it's the resistance in the arteries between contractions. So if you're really vasoconstricted, and you would find that in shock, then we're going to start seeing the diastolic blood pressure coming up from 80 to 90 or whatever it might be, depending on how vasoconstricted that vessel is. The systolic blood pressure is going to tell us how hard that left ventricle is working. In a shock situation, that left ventricle might be working super hard in preload, trying to get blood out to the vessels, or out to the cells rather. So it's super preloaded out and it's pumping 140 times per minute. That left ventricle is going to start failing. And so we'll see the systolic blood pressure start coming down, meaning it's not, the overall health of that left ventricle is not good. And then we'll see diastolic blood pressure, the bottom, the diastolic, coming up. And the closer those guys get, the more narrow that blood pressure gets, signaling to us about danger. A review of hydrostatic pressure. So the force exerted on the inside of the vessel walls as a result of blood pressure and volume. So increase in hydrostatic pressure will cause fluid to be forced through the capillary wall. Now remember, it says fluid, right? What are you talking about, Instructor Moore? So let me tell you. We're talking about plasma. That cellular blood is not going to go anywhere unless there's trauma involved. Right? In a medical situation, if hydrostatic pressure is increased, the only thing that can get through the cellular membrane is fluid, mostly water, plasma. So that's what we're talking about. And when that fluid spills out of the vessels, right? When plasma comes out of the vascular container, it becomes known as edema, right? So a lot of times people with congestive heart failure, right? They have a blood pressure of 180 over 110. So that hydrostatic pressure is super high, right? Super high. Anytime you have an increase in blood pressure, you're going to have an increase in hydrostatic pressure. That blood is just rushing down, and it's causing that hydrostatic pressure is causing that plasma to leak out. That's known as edema. Capillaries in the lungs will leak fluid in between the capillaries as well. This will cause alveoli to move further away from the capillaries where gas exchange takes place, making it more difficult. Let me go back. Let's go back a slide. Let's look at this. Let's look at this. So look at this left ventricle. If this left ventricle is super preloaded out, it's not going to let me, there it goes. Super preloaded out, meaning it's stretched as far as it can go, and it's shooting blood shooting blood. It's contracting blood up here, right? It's sent because remember, what is that blood having to do? It's having to go up against gravity and around this aortic curve, right? So to go around the aortic curve, and that's difficult. So that's why that left ventricle is it's larger than the right ventricle, because it has to do stuff like this. So it's increased its muscular strength. It's increased the contraction. So the force of the contraction and the velocity of blood is going to be increased. You have blood rushing through this way, but what happens? It drops like a waterfall. See that? Blood's rushing down the waterfall. And it gets here and it gets into the tinier circulation. These vessels right here aren't as large as the vessel is up here. It's almost like water hammer. All this blood rushing down. Well, the fluid part has nowhere to go. It's coming out so fast and it comes down to these smaller arteries that it's going to spill over. It's going to spill over. It's coming out because it can't handle the velocity that it's at. It spills over. And once that plasma comes out, it's known as water now. It's no longer plasma, it's water. And where's gravity going to take it? Downward. Gravity's going to take it downward. And where does that go? It goes into your feet. Goes into your feet. So anytime you have an increase in blood pressure, you're going to have an increase in hydrostatic pressure, forcing of the fluid through the capillary walls into the tissue. So hydrostatic pressure drives fluid out of the vessels. One sec. It's going to drive that fluid outside of the vessel, right? Well, it's coming out. Well, osmotic pressure, what we talked about the other day in the first video we did, osmotic pressure is going to allow, once the blood pressure comes down, it's going to allow that fluid to be sucked back into the vascular container. And it does that through something called albumin. And that is one of the things, remember, that's floating around is one of the properties of plasma. All right, and we'll talk more about this. Well, again, this is a normal alveoli right here. We have normal blood flow. Remember, those the capillaries set just on top of the alveoli. And we want it to be really close, right? We want it to be really close so that the proper gas exchange can take place. Remember, you're going to have CO2 going in, and you're going to have O2 coming out to the cell. That's how we want it to be. Well, with increased hydrostatic pressure, what happens? It pushes it, because it's pressure, and it pushes those capillaries out. It pushes them out. And it's hard for gas exchange to take place because you've increased the amount of travel that the CO2 has coming in and the O2 has coming out. You've increased the distance. It's harder for O2 now to come out into the cell because you've increased that distance. Not only that, but look at this. Fluid now it's because it's out there. It's been, remember, all this is blood. These are tiny capillaries, but it doesn't matter. That fluid's coming in where it doesn't belong because it's being forced out into the alveoli. Once there's so much fluid being forced out then it starts covering the alveoli. And that's where you get pulmonary edema from. Right here's one, it's congested, but over here is full-blown pulmonary edema. You have large amounts of fluid that's forced into the alveoli. I mean, we can go back just to make it more clear. Let's go back, make it more clear. All right, here you go. What are these? These are blood vessels. You have your pulmonary vein right here, which has oxygenated blood. Pulmonary artery right here. Pulmonary artery right here. What's happening? Blood is through hydrostatic pressure is being forced out. That fluid's being forced out. See how it's being forced out? These are tiny vessels. That pressure is too high, way too high. It can't handle the volume that it's being pumped out at. It's sending, and so what's in it? It's full send, guys. Full send of fluid into the alveoli. Has nowhere to go. Pressure's too high. It's invading the alveoli here, covering them up. And that pressure also causes that distance to be increased to where it can't make a gas exchange. And that's what hydrostatic pressure does. So increase in blood pressure, increase in hydrostatic pressure. If you have too much hydrostatic pressure, it's going to drive fluid out. All right, let's review again. Let's talk about cellular metabolism. So we know cells require energy to survive. We know that energy is defined as ATP. Right? We know that. We know that it's a chemical reaction, right, between oxygen and glucose. If oxygen comes in the cell and finds glucose, all is good, right? We'll get byproducts between oxygen and glucose coming together. We'll get CO2, we get waste. Because anytime you have a reaction, you're going to have waste. You're going to get water. And where does the water go? It goes to the plasma, right? 99% water. We'll use that in the plasma. Also to get heat, right? And we're going to use that to keep that blood warm. We want that body temperature to be 98.2. When all the products are used or removed, this process is known as aerobic metabolism. That's what everybody's metabolism is right now, is aerobic. And that's what we're looking forward to having. All right, so when oxygen is not present in the cell, glucose cannot metabolize, and the chemical reaction that takes place is not ideal. Okay, so you're going to get very little energy, right? You're going to get very little ATP. You're going to have an increased amount of waste. So we had a normal amount of waste a minute ago. Now that CO2 is going to increase. And remember I said earlier that large amounts of CO2 are going to lead to acid. Right? This case is called lactic acid. And we're not going to get the heat that we need to help the body stay warm. And so anytime this happens, we call that anaerobic metabolism. And that's going to, if not corrected, is going to kill the cell and lead to cellular death. All right, let's talk about the nervous system. What's the function of the nervous system? Well, it's to control and maintain a conscious state of awareness, transmitting sensory stimuli to the brain for interpretation, controls motor function, transmitting motor impulses to muscles for voluntary and involuntary movement, helps to control body function through the autonomic nervous system. All right, so it helps control the skeletal muscles. It does voluntary, involuntary. It helps sure that fight or flight. All right, it coordinates a response by collecting information from body systems. Right, so remember, talking about chemoreceptors in EMT school. right? So those chemoreceptors are letting the body know, hey, we're getting too acidotic, so let's breathe faster. All right, so remember it divides into the CNS and the PNS. Right, so the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The PNS consists of everything else. You have the somatic nervous system that regulates activities over which a person has voluntary control: walking, talking, riding. The autonomic nervous system controls the many body functions that occur without voluntary control. So digestion, dilation, constriction of blood vessels, sweating, flight or fight response is a voluntary reaction. All right, the nervous system as a whole can be divided again to both the CNS and the PNS. All right, so you have the brain and spinal cord. The brain consists of the cerebrium, cerebellum, and the brainstem. Brain cells require a constant supply of glucose and oxygen, and the brain can't make its own glucose, so it relies on the body to do that. If we look at the cerebrium, it controls sensation through thought, associative memory. It controls motion that's under conscious control. If we looked at cerebellum, it controls muscle activity, balance, holds muscles in a state of a partial contraction, meaning they're ready to go in that partial contraction state when you need them to go. Let's look at the brainstem right here. Brainstem, it controls breathing, body temperature, cardiovascular, respiratory with the pons. So if you have a brainstem injury, you're probably going to die. I mean, it's the worst part that can be injured in the brain is the brainstem, right? Because that's where your cardiovascular, that's what controls the rhythm of your heart, controls the contractions of your heart, controls your diaphragm, all of it's there. We can break it down here. We have the frontal lobe, partial lobe, occipital lobe, the cerebellum right there, we call it the small brain, and the temporal lobe. You can kind of go through this slide. You don't need me to read it to you. Kind of go through it, gives you an idea of what parts of the brain control what. The spinal cord is an extension of the brain stem. Its major function is the conduction of nerve impulses. Remember, the brain and spinal cord are part of your CNS. All right, many nerves that enter and leave the spinal cord. These nerves all connect within the nerve centers located in the brain. Let's look at your peripheral nervous system. Nerves located outside of the spinal cord and brain. Remember I mentioned that reflex hammer earlier in one of the videos. That's how these afferent and efferent nerves work. Afferent nerves carry sensory information from the body to the spinal cord. So when I hit your knee with that reflex hammer, it goes up the afferent, and a message comes back down through the efferent from the brain to the spinal cord to the body, right? So we can just test both of those afferent and efferent pathways just by simply using a reflex hammer and tapping on your knee. Pretty neat. All right, so the functional division of the nervous system really just kind of comes down to voluntary versus involuntary. Voluntary nervous system influences the activity of skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system influences the things you can't control, like blood vessel size, etc. So here autonomic nervous system We have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So remember your fight or flight, right? Is your sympathetic and parasympathetics have opposite effects, and they act in a delicate balance. So your sympathetic activated once the body is challenged by stressors, trauma, blood loss, fright, your fight or flight. Your parasympathetic nervous system is going to help return to a state of normal. So let's look at an example of the sympathetic nervous system.
What the heck did you do? Just don't move. I think I have to change my underwear now.
All right, so there I think you could see an example of the sympathetic nervous system kicking in, right? I'm sure that their fight or flight kicked in at that. I mean, 20 feet up in a tree, they probably would have jumped out. Once their heart rate, all that, once the danger is going away, the bear comes down the tree, that parasympathetic nervous system is going to really kick in and help return them to more of a state of normal. Some of the stuff we really don't need to know. Let's see. The endocrine system, that consists of the ductless glands that secrete hormones. Hormones, chemically substance that travels throughout the body. Hormones target organs, causing changes in how the organ functions. Right? So hormones like insulin, things like that go through the endocrine system. We have the thyroid gland as part of that, and the parathyroid gland is part of the endocrine system. A big one here, the adrenal gland. It sits at the top of the kidneys, and this is the one that's going to release epi and norepi. Right? We'll talk more about epi and norepi later. So yeah, that's the big one. And then the sexual. The gonads, ovaries, and testes also are part of that as well. Remember the pancreas, the islets of Langerhans. The pancreas secretes insulin, which regulates blood levels. Inside the islets of Langerhans is where this takes place, inside the pancreas. Here we have the pituitary gland. Helps regulate growth, thyroid, pancreas, etc. Let's talk about epi and norepi. This is just a review. But still super important because you guys are going to be given this drug. It's one of your drugs that you'll be not just you won't necessarily have to use an EpiPen anymore. You can actually administer it. Hormones released by the adrenal glands. The two primary hormones in the fight or flight when it's activated. We have alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2. Let's look at alpha 1. Alpha 1 causes the vessels to constrict. This is where you get that vasoconstriction from. The vessels in the skin constrict, shunning or redirecting blood to the core of the body. Remember, one of the properties of blood is temperature control. So when blood gets shunted somewhere else, those areas are going to be cool. When alpha 1 is activated, so are the body's sweat glands. So this is what causes these shock patients to become cool and diaphoretic. It's because the sweat glands are actually activated. You can see somebody who's in super shock walk in, they're soaking wet with sweat, and they haven't, looks like they ran a marathon, but they haven't, right? Alpha 2 should be easy, right? Because it just kind of affects the release of alpha 1. So we don't have to really know too much about alpha 2. Beta 1, one heart. So effects are all related to the heart for beta 1. Increase in heart rate, increase in force of contraction, the increase in the electrical stimulus traveling down the heart's conductive system or pathways. Beta 2, the lungs, affects the smooth muscles to dilate, especially in the bronchioles. So so beta 2. This is what, the physiology that saves lives in asthma. Right, because beta 2, when you have somebody who's diaphoretic, when you have somebody who's anaphylactic shock, it's a perfect drug to give because why? Right, because it's going to help stop that smooth muscle contraction and allow those lungs to the smooth muscle to dilate again. Then we have the skin, the review here. I don't think I probably need to review the skin with you guys. I think you guys know about the epidermis, dermis, and then the basement level of the skin. And the same for the digestive system. I think we can probably fly through that along with the urinary system. And that is it. So this will be it for video lecture number 3. That's the anatomy portion. The next video to follow will be about the physiology of the body. So hope everyone is doing well again, and we will see you in the next video.